Welcome to this peaceful journey through ancient history, where we'll explore one of the most captivating figures who ever lived. Tonight, we're traveling back over 2,000 years to discover the extraordinary story of a woman whose intelligence, ambition, and political genius would make her the most powerful ruler of her time. Whether you're settling in for the night or simply looking to escape into the fascinating world of ancient Egypt, I'm grateful you've chosen to spend this time with us. I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight, what city or country, and what time it is as you press play. There's something magical about how ancient history can connect us across continents and time zones. If these gentle historical journeys help you find peace at the end of your day, consider subscribing for many more stories that will carry you into restful sleep. This isn't some romanticized tale from Hollywood. This is the real story of Cleopatra VII, the last pharaoh of Egypt, whose remarkable life was far more complex and fascinating than any movie could capture. Have you ever wondered how a young woman could rise to rule the most prosperous kingdom in the ancient world, while navigating deadly palace intrigue, foreign invasions, and the collapse of the Roman Republic itself? The answer lies not in the beauty that legends celebrate, but in a brilliant political mind that could speak 9 languages, debate philosophy with the greatest scholars of Alexandria, and command the loyalty of both her people and the most powerful men in Rome. What I'm about to reveal will transform everything you thought you knew about this legendary queen. Cleopatra wasn't just a ruler who happened to be beautiful. She was a master strategist who used every tool at her disposal, including her intellect, charisma, and yes, her charm, to preserve Egyptian independence during one of the most turbulent periods in ancient history. She was the last pharaoh of a dynasty that had ruled Egypt for 3 centuries, and she would stop at nothing to ensure that legacy continued. Today, I'm going to take you inside the golden palaces of Alexandria, where Cleopatra learned to wield power with surgical precision. You'll discover how she transformed Egypt into a Mediterranean superpower, commanded fleets that controlled the eastern sea routes, and built alliances that would shake the foundations of the Roman world. By the end of this journey, you'll understand why Cleopatra's story has captivated humanity for over 2 millennia, and why her legacy continues to influence how we think about power, leadership, and the eternal struggle between East and West. But before we witness her rise to ultimate authority, let me paint you the world into which Cleopatra was born. A world where the great powers of antiquity were locked in an endless dance of alliance and betrayal that would determine the fate of civilization itself. The year was 69 BCE, and the ancient world was experiencing unprecedented upheaval. The Roman Republic, which had spent centuries conquering the Mediterranean, was beginning to tear itself apart through civil wars and political chaos in the east. The remnants of Alexander's empire still commanded vast wealth and territory, while Egypt remained the most prosperous kingdom in the world, its capital Alexandria serving as the center of learning, trade, and culture. Into this world of shifting alliances and constant danger was born Cleopatra VII Philipata, daughter of Ptolemy XII, in the magnificent palace complex of Alexandria. Her birth name meant glory of the father, but she would forge a glory entirely her own that would eclipse that of any pharaoh who came before her. The Ptolemaic dynasty that Cleopatra inherited had ruled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries, ever since one of Alexander the Great's generals, Ptolemy I, had claimed the ancient kingdom as his prize after Alexander's death. For 13 generations, the Ptolemies had maintained their Greek identity while adopting the pharaonic traditions that legitimized their rule over the Egyptian people. Cleopatra's childhood was spent in the most magnificent city of the ancient world. Alexandria was home to over 500,000 people from dozens of different cultures and kingdoms. The Great Lighthouse, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, guided ships from across the Mediterranean into the city's bustling harbors. The famous library contained hundreds of thousands of scrolls representing the accumulated knowledge of human civilization. Greek philosophers debated in the marble halls alongside Egyptian priests and Jewish scholars. Roman merchants negotiated with Arabian traders, while African ambassadors conducted diplomatic business in the royal palace. This cosmopolitan environment would profoundly shape Cleopatra's worldview and her understanding of how to navigate between different cultures and political systems. From her earliest years, Cleopatra displayed an intelligence and determination that set her apart from her siblings. While most Ptolemaic rulers were content to speak only Greek and rely on interpreters for official business, Cleopatra made herself fluent in Egyptian, the first pharaoh in her dynasty to master the native language of her subjects. She would eventually speak 9 languages fluently, including Hebrew, Arabic, Ethiopian, and Latin. Her education was extraordinary, even by royal standards. The greatest scholars in Alexandria served as her tutors, teaching her mathematics, philosophy, rhetoric, and the arts of governance. She studied the works of Aristotle and Plato, memorized the poetry of Homer, and learned to debate complex philosophical questions with the intellectual sophistication of a trained scholar. But Cleopatra's education extended far beyond academic subjects. She was taught the practical arts of ruling, including military strategy, economic policy, and the delicate art of diplomacy. She learned to read people's motivations, to identify their strengths and weaknesses, and to craft arguments that would persuade them to support her objectives. Most importantly, Cleopatra studied the history of her own dynasty and the lessons it offered about survival in a world dominated by more powerful neighbors. The Ptolemies had maintained their independence for centuries by playing larger powers against each other, by making themselves indispensable to foreign allies, and by never appearing so weak as to invite conquest or so strong as to provoke preemptive attack. These lessons would prove invaluable as Cleopatra came of age during one of the most dangerous periods in Egyptian history. The Roman Republic was expanding its influence throughout the Eastern Mediterranean, and several Ptolemaic rulers had already been forced to accept Roman protection in exchange for their continued reign. The question facing Cleopatra's generation was not whether Egypt would eventually fall under Roman control, but whether it could maintain enough autonomy to preserve its distinctive culture and prosperity. Cleopatra's father, Ptolemy XII, had spent much of his reign struggling with this exact dilemma. Known mockingly as the flute player, because of his love for music, he had been forced into exile by Alexandrian nobles who resented his accommodation with Roman power. He regained his throne only with Roman military support, making Egypt effectively a Roman client state. This humiliating dependence on foreign protection deeply influenced Cleopatra's political development. She witnessed firsthand how even the most ancient and prosperous kingdoms could lose their independence through weakness or poor strategic choices. She observed how Roman politicians and generals viewed Eastern kingdoms as sources of wealth to be exploited, rather than as legitimate political entities deserving respect. These experiences taught Cleopatra that survival required not just intelligence and diplomatic skill, but also the ability to project strength and confidence in negotiations with more powerful neighbors. She would need to convince Romans that Egypt was valuable enough as an ally to be worth preserving, while simultaneously demonstrating that any attempt to annex the kingdom would be costly and difficult. The challenge was complicated by internal political dynamics within Egypt itself. The Ptolemaic court was riven by factional disputes, personal rivalries, and competing claims to royal succession. Palace intrigue was a constant threat as ambitious nobles, military commanders, and royal relatives plotted to advance their own interests at the expense of dynastic stability. Cleopatra learned to navigate these treacherous waters with remarkable skill for someone so young. She built relationships with key military officers who controlled the armies that defended Egypt's borders. She cultivated support among the priests who managed the temples that legitimized pharaonic authority in the eyes of the Egyptian people. Most crucially, she established connections with the scholars and administrators who actually ran the complex bureaucracy that governed one of the world's most populous and economically productive kingdoms. This early political education was interrupted in 58 BCE when Cleopatra was just 11 years old. Her father was driven from Alexandria by a popular uprising, forcing the royal family into exile and leaving Egypt in the hands of Ptolemy XII's older daughter, Berenice IV. The experience of exile was traumatic for the young princess, but it also provided invaluable lessons about the fragility of political power and the importance of maintaining popular support. During the 3 years of exile, Cleopatra accompanied her father to Rome, where she observed the workings of the Republic at close range. She met the senators and generals who controlled Roman policy toward the Eastern Mediterranean, learning to understand their motivations, their factional disputes, and their individual personalities. She witnessed the corruption and violence that characterized Roman politics, but also the efficiency and ruthlessness that had made Rome the dominant power in the Mediterranean world. Most importantly, Cleopatra observed how her father negotiated for Roman support to regain his throne. She watched him promise tribute payments, trading concessions, and military cooperation in exchange for the legions that would restore him to power. She saw how Romans viewed these arrangements as profitable investments rather than acts of generosity, and how they expected increasing returns on their support over time. These observations would prove crucial to Cleopatra's later success in dealing with Roman leaders. She understood that Romans respected strength and were attracted to wealth and luxury, but that they also had a practical appreciation for competent administration and reliable partnership. She learned that successful diplomacy with Rome required offering concrete benefits while projecting confidence and independence. The family returned to Alexandria in 55 BCE with Roman military support, and Ptolemy XII was restored to his throne. Berenice IV was executed, eliminating one potential rival to Cleopatra's eventual succession. But the restoration came at enormous cost. Both financial and political, Egypt was forced to pay massive tributes to Rome, and Roman troops remained stationed in Alexandria as a permanent reminder of the kingdom's dependent status. Cleopatra spent her teenage years learning to operate within this constrained environment. She could not openly oppose Roman influence without risking her dynasty's survival, but she also could not simply accept permanent subordination without losing the respect of her subjects and the independence that made Egypt worth ruling. Her solution was characteristically sophisticated and patient. She would work within the Roman system while gradually building Egypt's strength and her own political capabilities. She would demonstrate her value as an ally while preparing for the day when changed circumstances might allow greater independence. And she would master every skill necessary for successful leadership, from military strategy to economic policy to the subtle arts of personal persuasion. The opportunity to put these preparations to use came sooner than anyone expected, in ways that would test every aspect of Cleopatra's remarkable education and natural abilities. In 51 BCE, when Cleopatra was just 18 years old, her father Ptolemy XII died suddenly, leaving the throne of Egypt to his eldest surviving child. According to Ptolemaic tradition, she would rule jointly with her younger brother Ptolemy XIII, who was only 10 years old at the time. This co-rulership arrangement was designed to maintain dynastic legitimacy while ensuring that real power remained with the more experienced ruler. But from the moment of her coronation, Cleopatra faced challenges that would have overwhelmed a less prepared leader. The kingdom she inherited was burdened with enormous debts to Roman creditors. Its military was weakened by years of neglect, and its nobility was divided into factions that viewed the young queen with suspicion and opportunistic calculation. The economic situation was particularly dire. Egypt's legendary wealth had been steadily drained by tribute payments to Rome and the costs of maintaining Ptolemy XII's restoration. The annual flooding of the Nile, which provided the foundation for Egyptian agriculture, had been irregular in recent years, reducing crop yields and creating food shortages that threatened social stability. Cleopatra's response to these challenges revealed the political genius that would characterize her entire reign. Rather than attempting to address every problem simultaneously, she prioritized the issues that would have the greatest impact on her long-term ability to rule effectively. She understood that political survival required her to demonstrate competence quickly while building the coalitions necessary for sustained success. Her first priority was establishing her authority over the complex bureaucracy that actually governed Egypt. The Ptolemaic administrative system was one of the most sophisticated in the ancient world, with specialized departments managing everything from tax collection to temple maintenance to foreign trade. But this bureaucracy had grown accustomed to operating with minimal royal oversight, and many officials were more loyal to their own interests than to the crown. Cleopatra spent her first months as pharaoh conducting a systematic review of governmental operations, meeting with department heads, examining financial records, and evaluating the competence and loyalty of key personnel. This process allowed her to identify both the most capable administrators and those who might pose threats to her authority. She made strategic personnel changes that strengthened her control while improving governmental efficiency. Officials who demonstrated competence and loyalty were promoted to positions of greater responsibility. Those who appeared unreliable or potentially disloyal were transferred to less sensitive roles or removed entirely. The changes were implemented gradually to avoid disrupting essential services, but the cumulative effect was to place the entire governmental apparatus under direct royal control. Simultaneously, Cleopatra began addressing Egypt's financial crisis through a combination of economic reforms and diplomatic initiatives. She negotiated more favorable terms with Roman creditors, arguing that Egypt's long-term ability to repay its debts depended on maintaining sufficient resources for productive investment. She restructured internal taxation to reduce burdens on farmers and merchants, while ensuring adequate revenues for essential governmental functions. More innovatively, she launched new trading initiatives that capitalized on Egypt's strategic position between Africa, Asia, and Europe. Alexandria's ports were expanded and modernized to accommodate larger merchant vessels. New trade agreements were negotiated with kingdoms throughout the Mediterranean and beyond. The famous Egyptian grain exports were supplemented by luxury goods, manufactured products, and exotic materials from the African interior. These economic policies demonstrated Cleopatra's sophisticated understanding of how political power and economic prosperity reinforced each other. By strengthening Egypt's financial position, she reduced the kingdom's dependence on Roman support, while creating resources that could be used to build military capabilities and purchase diplomatic influence. But Cleopatra's most crucial early challenge involved managing the complex relationship with her younger brother and co-ruler. Ptolemy XIII was too young to govern effectively, but he was surrounded by ambitious advisors who saw the regency as an opportunity to advance their own interests. These advisors, led by the eunuch Pothinus and the general Achilles, began encouraging the young king to assert greater independence from his sister's authority. The tension between the royal siblings reflected deeper conflicts within Egyptian society about the kingdom's future direction. Cleopatra represented a more assertive approach that emphasized Egyptian independence and cultural distinctiveness. Her brother's faction favored closer accommodation with Roman power, arguing that survival required accepting permanent subordination in exchange for protection. These philosophical differences became practical conflicts over specific policy decisions. When Rome requested Egyptian military assistance for campaigns in other parts of the Mediterranean, Cleopatra wanted to negotiate conditions that would benefit Egypt's interests. Her brother's advisors preferred to comply immediately with Roman demands, viewing cooperation as the safest path to continued rule. The dispute intensified when news arrived that civil war had erupted in Rome itself. Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great, the two most powerful men in the Roman world, were leading armies against each other in a conflict that would determine the future of the Republic. Both sides were seeking support from client kingdoms throughout the Eastern Mediterranean, creating opportunities for Egyptian diplomacy, but also enormous risks. Cleopatra recognized that this Roman civil war represented both the greatest danger and the greatest opportunity her kingdom had faced in generations. If she chose the winning side, Egypt could potentially gain greater independence and more favorable terms in its relationship with Rome. But if she backed the losing faction, the consequences could include invasion, conquest, and the complete destruction of the Ptolemaic dynasty. Her brother's advisors wanted to support Pompey, who had previously helped restore Ptolemy XII and seemed to represent continuity with existing arrangements. They argued that backing the established Roman leader was safer than gambling on Caesar, whose victory was far from certain and whose intentions toward Egypt remained unclear. But Cleopatra's analysis of the situation was characteristically more sophisticated. She had studied both men during her time in Rome and understood their different approaches to governing conquered territories. Pompey represented the traditional Roman aristocracy, which viewed Eastern kingdoms primarily as sources of wealth to be exploited. Caesar, despite his reputation for ruthlessness, had shown greater flexibility in his dealings with foreign peoples and seemed more interested in building sustainable alliances than in simple extraction. More importantly, Cleopatra's intelligence networks provided her with better information about the military situation than her brother's advisors possessed. Her sources suggested that Caesar's forces were better organized and more motivated than Pompey's, despite being outnumbered. She believed that Caesar's innovative military tactics and the loyalty he commanded from his veteran legions gave him significant advantages that traditional Roman observers were failing to recognize. The disagreement over Roman policy created an irreconcilable split between the royal siblings that would ultimately determine the fate of the dynasty Ptolemy. The 13th's advisors convinced him that his sister's policies were dangerous to Egypt's survival and that he should assert his authority as the senior male ruler. In 48 BCE, they orchestrated a palace coup that forced Cleopatra to flee Alexandria and seek refuge in the countryside. This exile represented the greatest crisis of Cleopatra's young life, but it also provided the opportunity that would establish her as one of history's most remarkable rulers. Rather than accepting defeat or negotiating a compromise that would leave her brother's faction in control, she chose to bet everything on a strategy so audacious that even her closest supporters questioned her judgment. She would seek a personal alliance with Julius Caesar himself, the most powerful and dangerous man in the Roman world. The decision required her to travel secretly across the Mediterranean, penetrate Roman military lines, and gain access to Caesar while he was conducting active military operations. If successful, the alliance could restore her to power and transform Egypt's relationship with Rome. If it failed, she would likely face execution as a traitor to Roman interests. The journey that would change the course of ancient history began on a moonless night in the autumn of 48 BCE, when Cleopatra and a small group of loyal supporters boarded a merchant vessel in a remote harbor along Egypt's Mediterranean coast. Their destination was Alexandria, where Caesar had recently arrived with his legions after defeating Pompey's forces at the Battle of Pharsalus. The voyage was extraordinarily dangerous. Roman naval patrols controlled the waters around Alexandria, and Ptolemy, the 13th's forces were actively searching for the exiled queen. Discovery would mean immediate capture and probable execution. But Cleopatra had spent months planning every detail of the operation, using her knowledge of Mediterranean trading routes and her connections with merchant families to arrange safe passage. The ship that carried her was disguised as a routine commercial vessel, transporting textiles and luxury goods to Alexandria's markets. Cleopatra herself was hidden among the cargo, concealed in a way that would later become the subject of countless legends and artistic representations. The specific details of her concealment remain debated by historians, but But what matters is that the deception succeeded. Under cover of darkness, the ship entered Alexandria's harbour and docked at a wharf controlled by merchants loyal to Cleopatra's cause. From there, she was smuggled into the palace complex where Caesar had established his headquarters, using secret passages and loyal servants to avoid detection by her brother's guards and Roman sentries. The moment when Cleopatra revealed herself to Julius Caesar would become one of the most famous encounters in ancient history, though the actual details remain shrouded in legend and political propaganda. What is certain is that the meeting between the 21-year-old Egyptian queen and the 52-year-old Roman general would forge an alliance that would reshape the Mediterranean world and determine the fate of both their nations. Caesar was immediately impressed by Cleopatra's intelligence, courage, and political sophistication. Here was a young woman who had risked everything on a desperate gamble to regain her throne, demonstrating exactly the kind of boldness and strategic thinking that he valued in both allies and opponents. More importantly, she offered him something he desperately needed: the wealth and resources of Egypt to support his continuing campaigns against his Roman rivals. The alliance that emerged from their negotiations was based on mutual benefit rather than simple romance, though personal attraction certainly played a role in their relationship. Caesar agreed to restore Cleopatra to the Egyptian throne and provide Roman military support against her brother's faction. In exchange, she would provide Egypt's resources to support Caesar's political objectives and ensure Egyptian cooperation with Roman strategic interests. But implementing this agreement required Caesar and Cleopatra to overcome significant military and political obstacles that would test both their strategic capabilities and their commitment to their partnership. The first challenge they faced was immediate and deadly. Ptolemy XIII's advisors had no intention of allowing their carefully orchestrated coup to be reversed by Roman intervention. Within hours of Cleopatra's arrival at the palace, Pothinus and Achillas mobilized the 20,000 troops of the Egyptian royal guard surrounding the palace complex and demanding that Caesar surrender the exiled queen to face judgment for her alleged crimes against the legitimate pharaoh. Caesar found himself in an extraordinarily precarious position. His own forces in Alexandria numbered fewer than 4,000 legionnaires, vastly outnumbered by the Egyptian army that now controlled the city's streets and harbors. His ships were trapped in the harbor by a hostile fleet, and his supply lines back to Rome were completely severed. Any conventional military assessment would have concluded that his situation was hopeless. But Caesar had not conquered Gaul and defeated Pompey through conventional thinking. He recognized that the crisis in Alexandria represented an opportunity to demonstrate Roman power and resolve to the entire Eastern Mediterranean. If he could emerge victorious despite overwhelming odds, every client kingdom from Syria to Cyprus would understand that Roman friendship was worth preserving and Roman enmity was too dangerous to risk. His response to the Egyptian ultimatum was characteristically audacious. Rather than negotiating or seeking a face-saving compromise, Caesar declared that as a Roman consul, he had the authority to arbitrate disputes within Egypt's royal family. He announced that both Cleopatra and Ptolemy XIII would present their cases before him, and he would render a decision that would be binding on all parties. This proclamation transformed a military standoff into a legal proceeding, giving Caesar the initiative while forcing his opponents to respond to his agenda rather than pursuing their own. The young Ptolemy XIII was brought to the palace under Roman guard, ostensibly to participate in the arbitration, but actually becoming Caesar's hostage in the process. The proceedings that followed were a masterpiece of political theatre that demonstrated both Caesar's diplomatic skill and Cleopatra's remarkable ability to present her case persuasively. Speaking in fluent Latin, she argued that her brother's advisors had violated ancient Egyptian law by usurping royal authority from the rightful heir. She presented evidence of their corruption and mismanagement, while offering detailed plans for restoring Egypt's prosperity and maintaining its alliance with Rome. Ptolemy, the 13th's representatives, speaking through interpreters and clearly uncomfortable with the legal framework Caesar had imposed, could only repeat their claims that the young king was the legitimate ruler and that his sister's presence in Alexandria constituted rebellion against established authority. Their arguments seemed weak and unconvincing compared to Cleopatra's sophisticated presentation. Caesar's verdict was predetermined, but his reasoning established important precedents for Roman policy toward client kingdoms. He declared that Cleopatra was indeed the rightful pharaoh of Egypt, but that she would rule jointly with her brother as Egyptian tradition required. This decision appeared to satisfy both parties while actually ensuring Cleopatra's dominance, since she clearly possessed superior political skills and Roman backing. More significantly, Caesar announced that Egypt would henceforth be considered a friend and ally of Rome, rather than a mere client state. This elevated status came with both privileges and obligations that would reshape the relationship between the two powers. Egypt would contribute to Roman military campaigns when requested, but would also receive protection against foreign invasion and support for its economic development. The announcement of Caesar's decision triggered immediate violent resistance from Pothinus and Achilles, who recognized that accepting the verdict would mean the end of their political influence. They ordered their forces to storm the palace and capture both Caesar and Cleopatra, hoping that eliminating the Roman general would restore their control over Egyptian policy. What followed was one of the most dramatic sieges in ancient history, as Caesar's small force of legionnaires defended the royal palace complex against repeated assaults by vastly superior Egyptian numbers. The fighting raged for weeks, with Roman engineering skill and discipline barely compensating for their numerical disadvantage. Caesar's situation became desperate when Egyptian forces managed to cut off the palace's water supply and threaten its food stores. But rather than surrendering, he launched a series of nighttime raids that demonstrated the tactical superiority of Roman military training. Small units of legionnaires struck Egyptian camps and supply depots, creating confusion and undermining the morale of troops who had expected an easy victory. The turning point came when Caesar made the audacious decision to destroy part of Alexandria's famous harbour to prevent Egyptian ships from reinforcing the siege. Roman engineers set fire to enemy vessels moored near the palace. But the flames spread beyond their intended targets, ultimately reaching the Great Library of Alexandria and destroying thousands of irreplaceable scrolls. This destruction represented one of history's greatest cultural tragedies, but it achieved Caesar's immediate strategic objective. The fire created chaos throughout the city, allowing him to break out of the palace and establish a more defensible position along the harbour front. From there, his forces could receive supplies and reinforcements from Roman ships that managed to penetrate the Egyptian blockade. Cleopatra played a crucial role during the siege, using her knowledge of Alexandria's layout and her connections among the city's diverse population to gather intelligence and coordinate resistance activities. Her ability to communicate with Egyptians in their own language proved invaluable for maintaining popular support and countering the propaganda efforts of her brother's faction. The siege finally ended when Roman reinforcements arrived from Syria, providing Caesar with enough troops to launch a decisive assault on Egyptian positions. The battle that followed demonstrated the tactical superiority of Roman legions over traditional Eastern armies, even when the Romans were significantly outnumbered. Ptolemy XIII was killed during the fighting, either in battle or through assassination, by his own supporters, who hoped to escape Roman vengeance by eliminating the focal point of resistance. Pothinus and Achilles were captured and executed, ending the immediate threat to Cleopatra's rule, while sending a clear message about the consequences of opposing Roman policy. With her rivals eliminated and Caesar's legions controlling Alexandria, Cleopatra was finally secure on the throne of Egypt, but her victory came at enormous cost to the kingdom she now ruled. The siege had damaged Alexandria's infrastructure, disrupted trade throughout the eastern Mediterranean, and demonstrated Egyptian military weakness to potential enemies throughout the region. More importantly, the crisis had made Egypt's dependence on Roman protection more obvious and complete than ever before. Cleopatra owed her throne directly to Caesar's intervention, creating obligations that would influence Egyptian policy for years to come. She had achieved her immediate objective of regaining power, but at the price of accepting a relationship with Rome that offered limited room for independent action. Caesar remained in Alexandria for several months after the siege, ostensibly to ensure political stability, but actually enjoying the luxury and intellectual stimulation that Egyptian civilization could provide. This extended stay allowed his relationship with Cleopatra to deepen beyond their initial political alliance into something that combined genuine affection with continued strategic cooperation. Their partnership during this period demonstrated how personal relationships and political calculations could reinforce each other in the complex world of ancient diplomacy. Caesar found in Cleopatra an intellectual equal who could discuss philosophy, literature, and statecraft with the same sophistication as the best-educated Romans. She provided him with insights into Eastern Mediterranean politics and access to Egyptian resources that supported his continuing campaigns against his remaining rivals. Cleopatra, meanwhile, gained an intimate understanding of Roman political culture and military capabilities that would prove invaluable for managing Egypt's future relationship with the expanding empire. She learned how Roman commanders thought about strategy and logistics, how Roman politicians balanced competing interests and obligations, and how Roman society viewed foreign peoples and cultures. Most significantly, their relationship produced a son, Caesarion, whose birth in 47 BCE created new possibilities and dangers for both parents. The child represented a potential bridge between Egyptian and Roman civilizations, but also a complication that could influence succession politics in both kingdoms. When Caesar finally departed Alexandria to continue his campaigns against remaining Republican forces, he left behind a transformed Egypt that was more closely integrated with Roman power than ever before. But he also left Cleopatra with the knowledge, resources, and political connections necessary to navigate the complex challenges that lay ahead. The queen, who had risked everything on a desperate gamble to regain her throne, had emerged victorious, but her triumph was only the beginning of an even more extraordinary phase of her remarkable career. The alliance with Caesar had restored her to power and demonstrated her political capabilities to the entire Mediterranean world. Now she would need to prove that she could use that power to advance Egyptian interests while maintaining the delicate balance of cooperation and independence that successful client rulers required. The years that followed Caesar's departure would test every skill Cleopatra had developed during her education and early political career. She would need to manage Egypt's internal affairs while navigating the treacherous waters of Roman politics, where Caesar's enemies were already plotting their revenge, and his allies were positioning themselves for the power struggles that would determine the Republic's future. But the young woman, who had smuggled herself into Alexandria to forge an alliance with the most powerful man in Rome, had already demonstrated that she possessed the intelligence, courage, and strategic vision necessary to succeed where others had failed. Her next challenge would be to transform her personal victory into lasting benefits for the kingdom she had fought so hard to rule. The Egypt that Cleopatra now governed was simultaneously weakened by recent conflicts and strengthened by its new relationship with Roman power. The task before her was to rebuild Egyptian prosperity and independence, while avoiding the mistakes that had destroyed so many other Eastern kingdoms. Her success or failure would determine not only her own fate, but the survival of a civilization that had flourished along the Nile for over 3,000 years. As Caesar's ships disappeared beyond the horizon, carrying him back to the political struggles that awaited in Rome, Cleopatra stood on the palace balcony overlooking Alexandria's harbour, contemplating the enormous challenges and opportunities that lay ahead. She had won the first phase of her struggle for power, but the most difficult tests of her reign were yet to come. The woman who would become history's most famous queen was about to embark on the next stage of a journey that would take her from the palaces of Alexandria to the halls of Roman power, from the battlefields of the Eastern Mediterranean to the chambers where the fate of the ancient world would be decided. The months following Caesar's departure from Alexandria marked a crucial period in Cleopatra's development as a ruler. No longer could she rely on the immediate presence of Roman legions to enforce her authority, or the dramatic circumstances of a siege to unite her supporters. Instead, she faced the more complex challenge of governing effectively during peacetime, while building the foundations for Egypt's long-term prosperity and security. Her first priority was rebuilding the administrative systems that had been disrupted during the civil conflict with her brother. The palace bureaucracy had suffered significant losses during the siege, with many experienced officials either killed in the fighting or fled to avoid association with the losing faction. Cleopatra needed to replace these personnel while ensuring that the new appointees possessed both the competence to manage complex governmental functions and the loyalty to support her vision for Egypt's future. The process of administrative reconstruction revealed Cleopatra's sophisticated understanding of how power actually functioned within the Ptolemaic system. Rather than simply promoting existing officials or appointing personal favorites, she conducted systematic evaluations of candidates that considered their technical skills, their political reliability, and their ability to work effectively within the collaborative framework she was establishing. She created new positions that allowed talented individuals from diverse backgrounds to contribute to governmental operations. Greek scholars were appointed to manage diplomatic correspondence and foreign policy analysis. Egyptian priests were given expanded roles in provincial administration, recognizing their influence with local populations and their knowledge of regional conditions. Even some Roman residents of Alexandria were incorporated into advisory positions, where their understanding of Roman political culture could benefit Egyptian interests. This inclusive approach to governmental staffing served multiple strategic purposes beyond simply filling vacant positions. It demonstrated Cleopatra's commitment to representing all segments of Egyptian society, rather than favoring particular ethnic or social groups. It created a broader base of political support for her regime by providing advancement opportunities for talented individuals who might otherwise have remained excluded from positions of influence. Most importantly, the diverse composition of her administration provided Cleopatra with multiple perspectives on policy challenges and potential solutions. When considering diplomatic initiatives or economic reforms, she could draw upon advisors who understood different aspects of the complex environment in which Egypt operated. The economic reconstruction of Egypt required even more careful planning and innovative thinking. The recent conflicts had disrupted trade routes throughout the Eastern Mediterranean, reducing the commercial revenues that formed the backbone of Egyptian prosperity. Agricultural production had suffered from the diversion of resources to military operations, while the costs of rebuilding damaged infrastructure strained the royal treasury. Cleopatra's response to these economic challenges demonstrated the practical education she had received in governmental finance and commercial policy. Rather than attempting to restore pre-war conditions exactly as they had existed, she used the disruption as an opportunity to implement improvements that would strengthen Egypt's long-term competitive position. She initiated ambitious infrastructure projects that would enhance Egypt's capacity to serve as the commercial hub of the Eastern Mediterranean. The Great Harbour of Alexandria was expanded and modernized with new docking facilities that could accommodate the larger merchant vessels that were becoming standard for long-distance trade. Storage warehouses were constructed with improved designs that reduced spoilage and theft while increasing the volume of goods that could be efficiently processed. The famous lighthouse of Alexandria, damaged during the recent siege, was not merely repaired, but enhanced with new signaling capabilities that could guide ships safely to harbour even during severe weather conditions. This improvement made Alexandria more attractive to merchant captains while reducing the insurance costs that added to the price of goods traded through Egyptian ports. Beyond these physical improvements, Cleopatra implemented administrative reforms that streamlined commercial procedures and reduced the bureaucratic obstacles that had previously discouraged some traders from conducting business in Egypt. New standardized contracts simplified negotiations between Egyptian merchants and foreign trading partners. Dispute resolution procedures were established that could handle commercial disagreements quickly and fairly, reducing the uncertainty that made some business relationships unprofitable. The agricultural sector, which remained the foundation of Egyptian wealth, received particular attention in Cleopatra's reconstruction program. She invested royal resources in improving irrigation systems throughout the Nile Valley, ensuring that farmers could maximize their productivity during both normal flood years and periods when the river's annual inundation was less generous than usual. New crop varieties were introduced that could produce higher yields or grow successfully in marginal conditions. Agricultural techniques were improved through systematic experimentation and the sharing of successful innovations between different regions of the kingdom. Storage and transportation systems were enhanced to reduce losses during harvest and distribution. These agricultural improvements served both economic and political purposes. By increasing rural prosperity, they strengthened popular support for Cleopatra's regime among the Egyptian farmers, who constituted the majority of her subjects. The increased production also provided more resources for export, generating the foreign currency earnings that Egypt needed to purchase military equipment and luxury goods from other parts of the Mediterranean world. While focusing on internal reconstruction, Cleopatra also needed to manage Egypt's external relationships in a rapidly changing international environment. Caesar's victory in the Roman Civil War had established him as the dominant figure in Mediterranean politics, but his position was not yet completely secure. Other powerful Romans continued to challenge his authority, creating opportunities for Egyptian diplomacy, but also requiring careful navigation to avoid backing the wrong faction in future conflicts. Cleopatra maintained regular correspondence with Caesar, providing him with intelligence about political developments throughout the Eastern Mediterranean while seeking his advice on policy matters that might affect Roman interests. These communications served the practical purpose of coordinating Egyptian and Roman policies, but they also maintained the personal relationship that had proven so beneficial for both parties. More subtly, Cleopatra began cultivating relationships with other influential Romans who might play important roles in future political developments. She hosted visiting Roman senators and businessmen in Alexandria, demonstrating Egyptian hospitality while gathering information about the factional disputes and personal rivalries that drove Roman politics. These diplomatic efforts required Cleopatra to master the complex etiquette and cultural expectations that governed interactions between Romans and Eastern rulers. She needed to project appropriate respect for Roman power while maintaining the dignity befitting a pharaoh of Egypt. She had to offer valuable benefits to potential Roman allies without appearing desperate or overly subservient. The delicate balance she maintained during this period revealed her growing mastery of international diplomacy. Roman visitors to Alexandria found themselves impressed by her intelligence and cultural sophistication, while also recognizing that Egypt under her leadership could be a valuable partner for Roman interests in the Eastern Mediterranean. Cleopatra's diplomatic skills were tested more severely when news arrived that opposition to Caesar was crystallizing among Roman senators, who viewed his growing power as a threat to traditional republican institutions. The conspiracy that was forming included some of the most prominent names in Roman politics, suggesting that Caesar might face challenges even more serious than those he had already overcome. This development created both opportunities and dangers for Egyptian policy. If Caesar's enemies succeeded in removing him from power, Cleopatra would need alternative sources of Roman support to maintain her position. But if she appeared to be hedging her bets by cultivating relationships with Caesar's opponents, she might be seen as disloyal by the man who had restored her to the throne. Her solution to this dilemma demonstrated the political maturity she had developed during her years of exile and struggle. Rather than choosing sides prematurely, she positioned Egypt as a valuable ally for Roman stability in general, regardless of which particular leaders ultimately controlled Roman policy. She emphasized Egypt's contributions to Mediterranean commerce, its strategic location for military operations, and its cultural achievements that enhanced the prestige of Roman civilization. This approach allowed her to maintain relationships with multiple Roman factions while avoiding commitments that might prove problematic if political circumstances changed. She could offer friendship and cooperation to any Roman leader who respected Egyptian interests, while reserving the right to withdraw support from those who threatened Egypt's security or prosperity. The wisdom of this strategy became apparent in March of 44 BCE, when shocking news reached Alexandria that would transform the entire Mediterranean political landscape. Julius Caesar, the man who had restored Cleopatra to her throne and fathered her son, had been assassinated in the Roman Senate by a conspiracy of senators led by Marcus Brutus and Gaius Cassius. The assassination of Caesar created immediate crisis for Cleopatra and Egypt. Her most powerful protector was dead, her son was now fatherless, and her kingdom's future relationship with Rome was thrown into complete uncertainty. The conspirators who had killed Caesar might view Egypt as a hostile state that needed to be brought under closer Roman control. Alternatively, Caesar's supporters might blame Egypt for failing to provide adequate warning about the plot against their leader. Even more dangerous was the possibility that Caesar's death would trigger another Roman civil war that could devastate the Eastern Mediterranean. If competing Roman factions began fighting for control of the Republic, Egypt might be forced to choose sides in a conflict where the wrong choice could result in invasion and conquest. Cleopatra's response to Caesar's assassination revealed both her emotional resilience and her strategic sophistication. Despite the personal loss and political upheaval, she immediately began adapting Egyptian policy to the new realities created by his death. She understood that survival required quick thinking and decisive action rather than prolonged mourning or passive waiting for events to unfold. Her first priority was ensuring the immediate security of her own position and that of her son. Caesarion's existence made him both a valuable asset and a dangerous liability in the complex political environment that was emerging in Rome. Some of Caesar's supporters might view the boy as a legitimate heir to his father's legacy, while Caesar's enemies might see him as a threat that needed to be eliminated. Cleopatra increased security around the palace and established contingency plans for protecting Caesarion if circumstances required his removal from Alexandria. She also began quietly moving royal treasury assets to secure locations outside Egypt, creating financial reserves that could support resistance or exile if her regime faced serious threats. Simultaneously, she launched a comprehensive intelligence-gathering effort to understand the political situation developing in Rome. Egyptian merchants, diplomats, and scholars throughout the Mediterranean were instructed to report on political developments, military movements, and the positions being taken by various Roman leaders regarding Egypt and other Eastern kingdoms. This intelligence network provided Cleopatra with better information about Roman politics than many Romans possessed themselves. She learned that Caesar's assassination had not resolved the fundamental conflicts within the Republic, but had instead created new sources of instability that were likely to produce continued violence and political upheaval. The most immediate threat came from the liberators, as Brutus and Cassius styled themselves, who were attempting to restore traditional republican government by eliminating anyone associated with Caesar's policies. This faction viewed Eastern kingdoms like Egypt as corrupting influences that had encouraged Caesar's allegedly tyrannical behavior. But Caesar's death had also created opportunities for ambitious Romans who had been overshadowed by his dominance. Mark Antony, Caesar's most trusted lieutenant, was positioning himself as the protector of Caesar's legacy and the leader of his political faction. Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir, was claiming his inheritance and demanding recognition as his father's rightful successor. These competing claims suggested that another round of civil wars was inevitable, creating the same kinds of opportunities for Egyptian diplomacy that had originally brought Cleopatra to power. If she could identify the eventual winner and provide valuable support during the struggle, Egypt might gain an even more favorable relationship with Rome than had existed during Caesar's lifetime. But the risks were also enormous. The wrong choice could result in Egypt being treated as an enemy state by whoever ultimately controlled Roman policy. The complex factional disputes and personal rivalries that were emerging made it difficult to predict which side would ultimately prove victorious. Cleopatra's approach to this challenge drew upon all the lessons she had learned during her previous political crises. She would avoid premature commitments while gathering information about the various Roman factions and their likely prospects for success. She would maintain Egypt's military and economic strength to ensure that any alliance she eventually formed would be based on mutual benefit rather than desperate weakness. Most importantly, she would position herself as an indispensable ally for Mediterranean stability and prosperity, making it costly for any Roman leader to treat Egypt as an enemy. The queen, who had once smuggled herself into Alexandria to forge an alliance with Caesar, was about to embark on an even more complex diplomatic campaign that would determine whether the Ptolemaic dynasty could survive the chaos that was engulfing the Roman world. The political earthquake triggered by Caesar's assassination would test every skill Cleopatra had developed during her remarkable rise to power. She would need to navigate between competing Roman factions while maintaining Egyptian independence, protect her son while advancing his potential claims to power, and preserve her kingdom's prosperity while preparing for the possibility of renewed warfare. The young woman, who had already achieved the impossible by regaining her throne through sheer audacity and political brilliance, was about to face challenges that would either establish her as one of history's greatest rulers or serve as a cautionary tale about the limits of individual ambition in a world dominated by forces beyond any single person's control. The months that followed Caesar's death revealed the true extent of the chaos his assassination had unleashed upon the Roman world. What the conspirators had intended as a restoration of republican virtue had instead created a power vacuum that ambitious men throughout the empire rushed to fill. From Spain to Syria, generals and governors began calculating their chances of seizing ultimate authority, while the Roman Senate struggled to maintain even the pretense of legitimate government. For Cleopatra, monitoring these developments from Alexandria, the situation presented both unprecedented opportunities and existential dangers. Her intelligence networks reported that 3 distinct factions were emerging from the wreckage of Caesar's regime, each with different implications for Egypt's future security and prosperity. The self-proclaimed liberators, led by Brutus and Cassius, controlled significant military forces and enjoyed support among traditional Roman aristocrats who genuinely believed they were saving the Republic from tyranny. But their philosophical commitment to republican principles made them hostile to the kind of personal alliances that had characterized Caesar's relationship with Eastern rulers. They viewed kingdoms like Egypt as sources of corruption that had encouraged Caesar's alleged descent into autocracy. Mark Antony represented continuity with Caesar's policies and approach to governing the expanding Roman dominions. As Caesar's most experienced lieutenant, he understood the practical benefits of maintaining stable relationships with wealthy Eastern allies. But Antony's position was complicated by his rivalry with Octavian and his reputation for indulgence in luxury that some Romans viewed as evidence of weakness or corruption. Octavian, despite his youth and limited military experience, possessed the enormous advantage of being Caesar's legally adopted son and heir. His claim to inherit Caesar's name, wealth, and political legacy gave him legitimacy that his rivals lacked. But his inexperience in governing and commanding armies made him vulnerable to more seasoned opponents. Cleopatra's analysis of these competing factions revealed her sophisticated understanding of Roman political psychology. She recognized that each group offered different advantages and disadvantages for Egyptian interests. and that the eventual winner would likely emerge from a process of elimination that could take years to complete. Rather than choosing sides immediately, she decided to position Egypt as a valuable prize for whichever faction ultimately proved victorious. This strategy required her to maintain her kingdom's military strength, economic prosperity, and political independence while avoiding actions that would make permanent enemies of any potential Roman leaders. The approach she developed during this period demonstrated how personal relationships and strategic calculations could be separated when necessary. Despite her emotional attachment to Caesar's memory and her natural sympathy for his political allies, Cleopatra understood that Egyptian interests might ultimately require her to work with his enemies if they proved more capable of providing the security and stability that her kingdom needed. Her first concrete test came when Brutus and Cassius began demanding military support from Eastern kingdoms for their campaign against Caesar's supporters. The liberators argued that all legitimate governments had an obligation to help restore republican institutions by defeating the would-be tyrants who threatened Roman liberty. The request placed Cleopatra in an extraordinarily difficult position. Refusing to provide support could be interpreted as an act of hostility that might justify military action against Egypt, but providing assistance to Caesar's assassins would constitute a betrayal of the man who had restored her to power and fathered her son. Her response revealed the diplomatic skills she had honed during years of navigating complex political situations. Rather than giving a direct answer to the military assistance request, she launched into detailed discussions about Egypt's current security challenges and financial obligations that made immediate military cooperation problematic. She explained that Egypt was still recovering from the recent civil conflict and needed to maintain adequate forces for defending its own territory against potential threats from neighboring kingdoms. She noted that the kingdom's treasury was committed to reconstruction projects that were essential for maintaining the economic stability that made Egypt a valuable ally for any Roman faction. Most skillfully, she expressed philosophical support for the liberators' objectives, while questioning whether their military strategy was likely to achieve the restoration of republican government they claimed to seek. She suggested that premature military action might actually strengthen their opponents by creating the appearance of a foreign conspiracy against legitimate Roman authority. This response allowed Cleopatra to avoid making immediate commitments while gathering more information about the developing situation. The liberators were forced to accept her explanations without being able to claim that she had definitively refused their requests. Meanwhile, she gained valuable time to observe how the various Roman factions were positioning themselves for the conflicts that lay ahead. Her intelligence networks were reporting increasingly disturbing information about the military preparations being undertaken by all sides in the developing Roman civil war. Brutus and Cassius were recruiting troops throughout the eastern provinces while demanding financial contributions from cities and kingdoms that had previously enjoyed favorable relationships with Rome. Mark Antony was building his own military coalition while attempting to forge a working relationship with Octavian that would allow Caesar's supporters to present a united front against their enemies. The negotiations between these two ambitious men were proceeding slowly and with obvious mutual suspicion, but their success or failure would determine the balance of forces in any future conflict. Octavian was demonstrating political skills that surprised observers who had dismissed him as an inexperienced youth trading on his adoptive father's reputation. He was systematically building support among Caesar's veteran soldiers while cultivating relationships with senators who had been neutral during the initial crisis following the assassination. Most ominously for Egypt's security, all of the competing factions were viewing Eastern kingdoms as potential sources of the wealth and military support they needed for their campaigns against each other. The days when Egypt could maintain its independence through careful neutrality were clearly ending, replaced by a situation where active partnership with one side or another would become unavoidable. Cleopatra understood that delay could only postpone rather than prevent the difficult choices that lay ahead. But she also recognized that premature action could prove even more dangerous than continued neutrality. The key was identifying the moment when the balance of forces had shifted sufficiently to make a reasonably confident prediction about the likely outcome of the Roman power struggle. That moment arrived in the autumn of 43 BCE, when news reached Alexandria that would fundamentally alter Cleopatra's strategic calculations. Mark Antony and Octavian had overcome their mutual suspicions sufficiently to form a formal alliance, creating the Second Triumvirate, along with Marcus Lepidus, another of Caesar's former lieutenants. The formation of this three-man coalition gave Caesar's supporters significant advantages in resources and military strength compared to the liberators. More importantly, for Egyptian interests, it suggested that the ultimate victors in the Roman civil war would likely be individuals who shared Caesar's pragmatic approach to governing eastern territories. But the triumvirate's first actions revealed the ruthless methods they were prepared to employ against anyone they considered an enemy. They published proscription lists containing the names of hundreds of Romans who were declared enemies of the state, with rewards offered for their deaths and their property confiscated to fund military operations. Among those proscribed was Cicero, the greatest orator of his generation, whose speeches against Mark Antony had made him a target for elimination. The murder of such a respected figure demonstrated that the triumvirs were willing to sacrifice traditional Roman values and institutions to achieve their political objectives. For Cleopatra, the triumvirate's formation represented both an opportunity to align with the likely winners and a warning about the consequences of being perceived as an enemy. The men who had ordered Cicero's death would not hesitate to destroy Egypt if they viewed the kingdom as a threat to their interests or security. Her response to this development showed how thoroughly she had learned the lessons of her earlier political crises. Rather than waiting for the triumvirs to approach her with demands or requests, she took the initiative in establishing communication with their representatives and expressing Egypt's willingness to contribute to their cause. She dispatched embassies to both Antony and Octavian, carefully crafting messages that emphasized Egypt's historical friendship with Caesar and its desire to support his legitimate heirs against those who had murdered him. The communications were designed to appear as expressions of loyalty and friendship, rather than desperate attempts to avoid being added to the proscription lists. More substantively, she began preparing concrete offers of assistance that would demonstrate Egypt's value as an ally, while not committing resources so extensively that the kingdom would be left defensively vulnerable. Egyptian grain shipments were redirected to supply Roman armies, generating goodwill while reducing the food supplies that might be available to the triumvir's enemies. Egyptian naval forces were quietly positioned to control sea routes that could be used by Brutus and Cassius to move troops or supplies between their bases in the eastern provinces. These deployments were presented as routine security measures, but their strategic implications were clear to anyone familiar with Mediterranean maritime operations. Most importantly, Cleopatra opened negotiations for providing direct financial support to the triumvirate's military operations. Egypt's legendary wealth could fund the purchase of equipment, the hiring of mercenaries, and the construction of siege engines that would give the triumvirs decisive advantages in their campaigns against the liberators. These initiatives required Cleopatra to overcome significant domestic opposition from Egyptian nobles and advisors who questioned the wisdom of involving their kingdom so directly in Roman political conflicts. Many argued that Egypt's interests would be better served by maintaining neutrality until the outcome of the civil war became clear. The debates within Cleopatra's court revealed the different perspectives that influenced Egyptian policymaking. During this crucial period, conservative advisors emphasized the risks of backing the wrong side in a conflict where miscalculation could result in conquest and the destruction of the Ptolemaic dynasty. Military commanders worried that committing Egyptian resources to support Roman operations would leave the kingdom vulnerable to attack from traditional enemies, who might view the civil war as an opportunity to settle old scores or seize valuable territory. Economic advisors calculated the enormous costs of supporting Roman military operations while maintaining Egypt's own defensive capabilities and continuing the internal reconstruction projects that were essential for long-term prosperity. But Cleopatra's analysis of the situation convinced her that the risks of neutrality were greater than the dangers of active involvement. She understood that the triumvirs viewed kingdoms that remained neutral as potential enemies who could not be trusted with important strategic responsibilities. More importantly, she recognized that this civil war represented Egypt's best opportunity in generations to forge a relationship with Rome based on genuine partnership rather than subordination. If she could demonstrate Egypt's value during the triumvir's struggle for power, she might be able to negotiate terms that would preserve Egyptian independence while providing the security that had become essential for survival in the Roman-dominated Mediterranean. Her decision to support the triumvirate was also influenced by intelligence reports suggesting that Brutus and Cassius were planning to establish more direct Roman control over Eastern kingdoms, regardless of whether those kingdoms had supported their cause. The liberators' commitment to traditional republican values apparently included opposition to the autonomous client relationships that had allowed places like Egypt to maintain their distinctive institutions and cultural practices. The choice between supporting the triumvirs or remaining neutral was therefore not really a choice between involvement and non-involvement in Roman affairs. It was a choice between active partnership with Romans, who had demonstrated flexibility in their approach to governing Eastern territories, and passive submission to Romans, who viewed Eastern kingdoms as obstacles to be eliminated rather than assets to be preserved. Cleopatra's commitment to supporting the triumvirate was formalized through a series of agreements negotiated during the winter of 43 BCE. Egyptian representatives met with Roman officials in Cyprus and Rhodes to establish the specific terms under which Egypt would contribute to the campaign against Brutus and Cassius. The agreements that emerged from these negotiations represented a significant evolution in Egypt's relationship with Rome. Unlike the previous arrangements that had characterized Egypt as a client state, providing tribute in exchange for protection, the new agreements treated Egypt as an allied kingdom, contributing to joint military operations for mutual benefit. Egypt would provide naval forces, financial resources, and logistical support for Roman operations in the Eastern Mediterranean. In exchange, the triumvirs guaranteed Egyptian territorial integrity, promised to consult with Cleopatra on policy matters affecting the eastern provinces, and agreed to recognize Caesarion as a legitimate member of Caesar's family with potential claims to inheritance. This last provision was particularly significant because it represented the first formal Roman recognition of Cleopatra's son's paternity and political status. The acknowledgement created new possibilities for Caesarion's future, while also providing him with protection against those who might view him as a threat to Roman stability. The implementation of these agreements required Cleopatra to mobilize Egyptian resources on a scale not seen since the great military campaigns of the early Ptolemaic period. Ships were assembled and equipped for extended naval operations. Treasure was gathered from temples and royal storehouses to fund Roman military expenses, and diplomatic representatives were dispatched to coordinate Egyptian activities with Roman strategic planning. But the most crucial aspect of Egypt's contribution to the triumvir's cause would be Cleopatra's personal involvement in the campaign against Brutus and Cassius. The agreement specified that she would personally command Egyptian naval forces during the decisive battle that would determine the fate of the Roman Republic. This provision transformed Cleopatra from a distant ally providing support for Roman operations into an active participant in the military campaign that would reshape Mediterranean politics. Her success or failure during the upcoming battle would determine not only the outcome of the Roman civil war, but also her own position as one of the most powerful rulers in the ancient world. The queen, who had once risked everything to forge an alliance with Julius Caesar, was about to stake her kingdom's future on an even more audacious gamble. She would lead Egyptian forces into battle alongside Roman legions, commanding ships and sailors whose performance could determine whether the triumvirate succeeded in establishing their authority over the entire Roman world. The teenage girl who had smuggled herself into Alexandria to meet Caesar had evolved into a mature ruler capable of making strategic decisions that would influence the course of ancient history. But the greatest test of her political and military capabilities still lay ahead in the waters off the coast of Greece, where the fate of both Egypt and Rome would be decided in a single climactic confrontation. As her ships prepared to depart Alexandria's harbour for what would become known as the Battle of Actium, Cleopatra understood that she was embarking on a journey that would either establish her as one of history's most successful rulers or mark the beginning of the end for the civilization she had worked so hard to preserve and protect. The warm Mediterranean breeze that filled her sails as the Egyptian fleet departed carried with it the hopes and fears of a kingdom whose survival now depended entirely on the political and military skills of the remarkable woman who had transformed herself from powerless exile into the most influential queen of the ancient world. The Egyptian fleet that departed Alexandria in the summer of 42 BCE represented the culmination of Cleopatra's efforts to transform her kingdom into a true Mediterranean naval power. Over 60 warships sailed in formation through the harbour's ancient channels, their bronze-reinforced prows gleaming in the morning sun as thousands of oars struck the water in perfect synchronization. These were not merely transport vessels pressed into military service, but purpose-built fighting ships designed according to the latest innovations in naval architecture. Egyptian shipwrights had studied captured vessels from across the Mediterranean, incorporating the best features of Rhodian engineering, Phoenician construction techniques, and Roman tactical modifications into designs that maximized both speed and combat effectiveness. The flagship that carried Cleopatra herself was a marvel of ancient engineering, stretching nearly 200 feet from stem to stern and powered by multiple banks of oars, manned by skilled Egyptian rowers. Golden decorations adorned its hull, while purple sails bearing the royal insignia proclaimed the presence of Pharaoh to anyone who witnessed the fleet's passage. But beneath this magnificent display lay months of careful preparation that revealed Cleopatra's understanding of how naval warfare had evolved during the Roman civil wars. Her ships carried not just traditional weapons like rams and grappling hooks, but also the newest siege engines adapted for maritime combat. Catapults capable of hurling burning projectiles had been mounted on reinforced decks, while specialized marines trained in boarding tactics were equipped with weapons designed for fighting in the confined spaces of enemy vessels. The intelligence networks Cleopatra had cultivated throughout the eastern Mediterranean provided her with detailed information about the naval forces being assembled by Brutus and Cassius. The liberators had convinced several Greek cities to contribute ships and crews to their cause, while their control of important islands gave them bases from which they could threaten Roman supply lines. More concerning were reports that the liberators were receiving support from kingdoms beyond Rome's traditional sphere of influence. Parthian gold was reportedly funding their operations, while rulers who had previously remained neutral were beginning to calculate whether Brutus and Cassius might offer them better terms than the triumvirs. These developments suggested that the coming conflict would involve far more than a simple struggle between competing Roman factions. The battle would determine whether the Mediterranean would remain unified under Roman authority or fragment into competing spheres of influence that could return the region to the chronic warfare that had characterized earlier centuries. For Cleopatra, sailing toward this decisive confrontation, the stakes could not have been higher. Victory would establish Egypt as an indispensable ally of whoever ultimately controlled Rome, potentially securing the independence and prosperity that had been her objectives since reclaiming her throne. Defeat could mean the destruction of everything she had worked to achieve, the conquest of Egypt by hostile forces, and the end of the Ptolemaic dynasty that had ruled the Nile Valley for 3 centuries. The voyage to the rendezvous point where Egyptian forces would join the triumvir's main fleet provided Cleopatra with final opportunities to review her strategy and prepare for the challenges ahead. She spent hours each day consulting with her naval commanders, refining tactical plans that would maximize Egyptian contributions to the joint operation while minimizing risks to her own forces. These planning sessions revealed the sophistication of the military education Cleopatra had received during her preparation for rule. She understood the importance of maintaining formation during complex maneuvers, the advantages of different tactical approaches depending on wind conditions and enemy positioning, and the crucial role that timing would play in determining the outcome of naval engagements. Her commanders were impressed by their queen's grasp of technical details that many rulers left entirely to their subordinates. She could discuss the relative merits of different ramming techniques, evaluate the effectiveness of various types of projectile weapons, and analyze how the size and design of enemy vessels would influence the tactics most likely to succeed against them. But Cleopatra's approach to military planning extended beyond purely tactical considerations to encompass the broader political implications of different strategic choices. She understood that her forces were participating in a battle that would be remembered throughout history, and that Egyptian performance during the engagement would influence Rome's attitude toward her kingdom for generations to come. This awareness shaped her instructions to her commanders about how Egyptian forces should be deployed during the battle. She wanted her ships positioned where they could make decisive contributions to the victory, demonstrating Egypt's military capabilities while avoiding unnecessary risks that might weaken her kingdom's future negotiating position. The political dimension of the upcoming battle was complicated by the complex relationships among the triumvirs themselves. Despite their formal alliance, Mark Antony and Octavian remained rivals whose cooperation was based on mutual necessity rather than genuine trust or shared vision for Rome's future. Cleopatra's intelligence reports suggested that tensions between the two men were increasing as their joint campaign progressed. Disagreements over strategy, disputes about the distribution of conquered territories, and competition for the loyalty of Caesar's veterans were creating strains that could eventually destroy their partnership. These internal conflicts within the triumvirate created both opportunities and dangers for Egyptian policy. If Cleopatra could position herself as a valuable ally for whichever triumvir ultimately emerged as the dominant partner, Egypt might benefit from the eventual resolution of their rivalry. But if she appeared to favor one over the other prematurely, she might find herself on the losing side of a conflict that could prove even more destructive than the current civil war. Her solution to this dilemma was characteristically sophisticated. She would demonstrate Egypt's value to the triumvirate as a whole, while carefully avoiding actions that might be interpreted as showing preference for either Antony or Octavian individually. Her forces would follow orders from the joint command structure, while maintaining enough independence to avoid being drawn into disputes between Roman leaders. The rendezvous with the main triumvirate fleet took place off the coast of Asia Minor, where hundreds of vessels from across the Roman world had assembled for the campaign against Brutus and Cassius. The sight of so many ships gathered in one location provided a powerful demonstration of the resources that Rome could mobilize when its various factions cooperated, rather than fighting among themselves. Cleopatra's arrival with her Egyptian squadron was greeted with appropriate ceremony that acknowledged her status as an allied sovereign rather than a subordinate commander. Roman officials who boarded her flagship were clearly impressed by the quality of Egyptian naval construction and the obvious competence of her crews. But the formal courtesies could not entirely mask the underlying tensions that characterized relationships between Romans and their Eastern allies. Some Roman officers made it clear that they viewed Egyptian participation as useful but not essential, while others seemed to regard Cleopatra's presence as an unwelcome complication that might interfere with purely Roman military decision-making. These attitudes revealed the fundamental ambiguity in Rome's approach to governing its expanding dominions. Roman success had been built on the ability to incorporate diverse peoples and cultures into a unified system, but many Romans remained uncomfortable with the idea that non-Romans might play important roles in determining imperial policy. Cleopatra navigated these cultural and political challenges with the diplomatic skills she had developed during years of managing complex relationships with Roman leaders. She projected appropriate respect for Roman military expertise, while making it clear that Egyptian forces would be commanded according to Egyptian judgment about their most effective deployment. The strategic conferences that preceded the battle provided Cleopatra with opportunities to demonstrate her understanding of naval warfare and contribute to the planning process. Her suggestions about enemy intentions and tactical approaches were taken seriously by Roman commanders who recognized her intelligence and experience. More importantly, these meetings allowed her to observe the decision-making processes that characterized Roman military leadership. She learned how Roman commanders balanced competing priorities, resolved disagreements about strategy, and maintained discipline within complex coalitions that included forces from multiple sources. This knowledge would prove invaluable for her future dealings with Roman officials, providing insights into Roman military culture that few non-Roman leaders possessed. She understood how Romans thought about risk and reward, how they evaluated the competence and reliability of their allies, and how they made the calculations that determined their approach to governing conquered territories. The battle that would determine the fate of the Roman Republic began at dawn on a calm October morning in 42 BCE. The opposing fleets faced each other across several miles of open water, their formations stretching beyond the horizon as commanders on both sides made final preparations for the engagement that would reshape Mediterranean politics. Cleopatra positioned her squadron according to the tactical plan developed during the strategic conferences, placing Egyptian vessels where they could support the main Roman attack while maintaining enough flexibility to respond to unexpected developments. Her ships formed a compact formation that could operate independently if necessary, while contributing to the overall effectiveness of the Allied fleet. The battle itself unfolded over several hours, as the massive fleets maneuvered for advantage in the shifting winds and changing tactical circumstances. Egyptian archers provided covering fire for Roman boarding parties, while Egyptian siege engines targeted enemy vessels that threatened to break through Allied lines. Cleopatra commanded her forces from the deck of her flagship, making tactical decisions based on her observation of the developing battle and communication with other Allied commanders. Her presence at the center of the action demonstrated her personal commitment to the alliance while providing her with first-hand experience of large-scale naval combat. The turning point came when coordinated attacks by Roman and Egyptian forces succeeded in breaking the formation of ships commanded by Cassius, creating gaps in the Liberators' defensive line that allowed Allied vessels to penetrate their rear areas. The psychological impact of this breakthrough was enormous, as crews on both sides could see that the battle's momentum was shifting decisively. What followed was less a continued battle than a systematic destruction of enemy resistance. Ships that had fought courageously while their formation remained intact began surrendering or fleeing when it became clear that continued resistance was hopeless. The Liberators' cause, which had seemed viable just hours earlier, collapsed with stunning rapidity once their naval superiority was broken. Cleopatra's forces played crucial roles during this final phase of the battle, pursuing fleeing enemy vessels and securing the surrender of ships whose crews had lost the will to continue fighting. Egyptian efficiency in these operations impressed Roman observers, who had questioned whether non-Roman forces could maintain discipline during the chaos that typically characterized the closing stages of major naval engagements. The victory was complete and decisive. Brutus and Cassius were both dead, either killed during the fighting or by their own hands when the hopelessness of their situation became apparent. Their surviving supporters were scattered across the eastern Mediterranean, lacking the resources or organization necessary to continue meaningful resistance. For the triumvirs, the battle represented the elimination of their most serious rivals and the establishment of their authority over the entire Roman world. For Cleopatra, it marked her emergence as one of the most important figures in Mediterranean politics, a queen whose military and political capabilities had been demonstrated on the largest possible stage. But victory also created new challenges and opportunities that would test Cleopatra's ability to capitalize on her success while avoiding the dangers that often accompanied rapid changes in international power relationships. The collapse of the liberators had removed one set of threats to Egyptian security, while potentially creating others as the triumvirs began planning how to govern their expanded dominions. The immediate aftermath of the battle saw Cleopatra participating in negotiations that would determine the distribution of territories, resources, and responsibilities among the various members of the victorious coalition. These discussions provided her with opportunities to advance Egyptian interests while demonstrating her value as an ally who deserved favorable treatment. Her negotiating position was stronger than it had ever been before. Egypt had contributed significantly to the victory through both military support and financial resources. Cleopatra had proven her competence as a military commander and political leader. Most importantly, the elimination of alternative sources of support in the Eastern Mediterranean made Egypt's continued alliance more valuable to Roman leaders. The agreements that emerged from these post-battle negotiations reflected Cleopatra's improved bargaining position. Egypt received guarantees of territorial integrity that were more comprehensive than previous arrangements. Egyptian trading rights were expanded to include access to markets that had previously been restricted. Most significantly, Caesarion's status as a member of Caesar's family was reaffirmed with provisions that could potentially support future claims to political inheritance. But these diplomatic successes were accompanied by developments that would ultimately prove more significant for Cleopatra's long-term prospects. During the extended negotiations that followed the battle, she found herself working most closely with Mark Antony, who had been assigned responsibility for governing Rome's eastern provinces. Antony was a complex figure whose reputation for military competence was balanced by concerns about his personal judgment and political reliability. He had been one of Caesar's most trusted lieutenants, but his relationships with other Roman leaders were often complicated by his impulsive temperament and his tendency to make commitments that exceeded his authority. The partnership that developed between Cleopatra and Antony during this period began as a practical alliance based on mutual benefit and shared objectives. Egypt needed Roman protection and support for its continued independence. Antony needed Egyptian resources and expertise for governing the diverse territories that had been placed under his authority, but their professional relationship gradually evolved into something more personal and politically significant. Both were experienced rulers who understood the complexities of governing in a world dominated by competing powers and shifting alliances. Both demonstrated their ability to make difficult decisions under pressure, while maintaining the flexibility necessary for survival in rapidly changing circumstances. Their growing partnership would ultimately reshape the balance of power within the Roman world, while creating new possibilities for Egyptian influence in Mediterranean politics. But it would also generate opposition from Romans who viewed the relationship as evidence that Eastern influences were corrupting traditional Roman values and institutions. The woman who had once smuggled herself into Alexandria to forge an alliance with Julius Caesar was about to embark on an even more consequential partnership that would determine not only her own fate, but the future relationship between East and West in the ancient world. The battle that had established her as one of the most powerful rulers in the Mediterranean was only the beginning of a new phase in her extraordinary career. As Egyptian ships loaded with treasure and glory prepared for their return voyage to Alexandria, Cleopatra stood once again on her flagship's deck, contemplating the opportunities and challenges that victory had created. She had achieved everything she had hoped for when she first decided to support the triumvirate's cause, but success had also created new responsibilities and dangers that would require all her intelligence and experience to manage effectively. The queen, who had transformed herself from exiled princess to Mediterranean power broker, was about to discover whether her remarkable political skills were sufficient to navigate the even more complex challenges that awaited her in the years ahead. The alliance with Antony that was beginning to form would either secure Egypt's independence and prosperity for generations to come, or lead to the final destruction of the dynasty she had fought so hard to preserve. The gentle waves that carried her fleet toward home whispered of the momentous changes that were already beginning to reshape the ancient world. Changes that would test every lesson Cleopatra had learned during her incredible journey from powerless teenager to one of history's most influential rulers. The months following Cleopatra's triumphant return to Alexandria marked a period of unprecedented prosperity and political influence for Egypt. The victory over Brutus and Cassius had not only secured the kingdom's independence, but had also elevated Cleopatra to a position where her voice carried weight in the councils that were reshaping the Mediterranean world. Her palace became a center of diplomatic activity, as representatives from across the Roman territories sought audiences with the queen whose military and financial contributions had proven so decisive in the recent conflict. Governors from Syria and Asia Minor requested Egyptian assistance with their administrative challenges. Merchant princes from Rhodes and Cyprus proposed new trading partnerships that would benefit from Egypt's enhanced political status. But beneath this surface of diplomatic success, Cleopatra was carefully observing developments within the triumvirate that would ultimately determine Egypt's long-term security. The partnership between Mark Antony and Octavian, which had seemed so solid during their campaign against the liberators, was showing signs of strain as both men began to consolidate their authority over different portions of the Roman world. Octavian had returned to Italy to manage the complex process of settling Caesar's veterans on lands that needed to be confiscated from existing owners. This task required delicate political maneuvering to satisfy the demands of soldiers who had fought for years without adequate compensation, while avoiding complete alienation of the civilian populations whose support was essential for stable governance. Meanwhile, Antony had established his headquarters in Athens, from where he was attempting to create a coherent administrative system for the diverse territories that stretched from the Aegean Sea to the Euphrates River. The challenge was enormous, involving dozens of different peoples with distinct languages, customs, and political traditions that had never been unified under a single authority. Cleopatra's intelligence networks provided her with detailed reports about the difficulties both men were encountering in their respective spheres of responsibility. Octavian was struggling with food shortages in Italy, as the disruptions caused by land redistribution reduced agricultural production. Antony was facing resistance from Greek cities that resented Roman taxation, and from local rulers who had previously enjoyed greater autonomy. These challenges created opportunities for Egyptian diplomacy, but they also highlighted the fundamental instability that characterized the post-Civil War settlement. The triumvirate had succeeded in eliminating their enemies, but they had not resolved the underlying conflicts that had produced the crisis in the first place. The question was not whether another round of civil wars would occur, but when and how the inevitable confrontation between the surviving triumvirs would unfold. Cleopatra's response to this analysis was characteristically strategic and patient. Rather than attempting to accelerate the breakdown of the triumvirate or openly favoring one side over the other, she positioned Egypt to benefit from whichever outcome ultimately emerged. She maintained cordial relationships with both Antony and Octavian, while building Egypt's military and economic capabilities to ensure that her kingdom would be valuable to whoever controlled Rome's future. This approach required her to master an even more complex form of diplomacy than she had previously practiced. She needed to demonstrate loyalty to both triumvirs without appearing duplicitous or opportunistic. She had to offer concrete benefits to each man's administration, while avoiding commitments that might conflict with each other if tensions between them escalated into open warfare. The delicate balance she maintained during this period was tested repeatedly, as both Antony and Octavian sought to secure Egyptian support for their competing visions of how the Roman world should be governed. Octavian emphasized traditional Roman values and institutions, arguing that stability required a return to the governmental structures that had made Rome great. Antony promoted a more flexible approach that incorporated Eastern customs and recognized the legitimacy of non-Roman forms of political organization. These philosophical differences had practical implications for Egypt's relationship with Rome. Octavian's traditionalist approach suggested that client kingdoms would need to conform more closely to Roman administrative procedures and cultural norms. Antony's flexibility implied that Egypt might be able to maintain greater autonomy while still contributing to Roman strategic objectives. But Cleopatra understood that the personal relationship between the two triumvirs was ultimately more important than their stated policy preferences. Both men were ambitious politicians who would adapt their positions as necessary to gain advantages over their rivals. The key was identifying which of them possessed the combination of military skill, political intelligence, and popular support necessary to emerge victorious from the confrontation that was becoming increasingly inevitable. Her assessment of this crucial question was influenced by direct observation of both men during the extended negotiations that had followed the victory over Brutus and Cassius. She had seen Octavian's methodical approach to complex problems, and his ability to maintain discipline among subordinates who might be tempted to pursue their own interests. She had also witnessed Antony's charismatic leadership style and his genuine understanding of the eastern territories that formed such an important part of the Roman world. Both men possessed significant strengths, but they also had weaknesses that could prove decisive in a direct confrontation. Octavian's youth and limited military experience made him dependent on advisors and generals whose loyalty might not survive a serious crisis. Antony's impulsive temperament and reputation for self-indulgence created vulnerabilities that skilled opponents could exploit. The decision about which triumvir to support became more urgent in the winter of 41 BCE, when Antony requested a personal meeting with Cleopatra to discuss their future cooperation. The invitation was diplomatically phrased, but its implications were clear. Antony was seeking to formalize an alliance that would provide him with Egyptian resources for the challenges he expected to face in governing the eastern provinces, and potentially in future conflicts with his Roman rivals. Cleopatra's response to this invitation would determine not only Egypt's immediate diplomatic alignment, but also her personal relationship with one of the most powerful men in the Roman world. The meeting could establish a partnership that would secure Egyptian interests for years to come, or it could create commitments that would prove costly if Antony's position weakened or if his rivalry with Octavian escalated beyond the point of peaceful resolution. The location Antony proposed for their meeting was symbolically significant. He suggested they convene in Tarsus, a wealthy commercial city in what is now southern Turkey, where Alexander the Great had once met with local rulers during his campaigns of conquest. The historical parallel was unmistakable. Antony was positioning himself as the heir to Alexander's legacy in the Eastern Mediterranean, while inviting Cleopatra to join him as a partner in governing the territories that had once formed the core of the Hellenistic world. For Cleopatra, the invitation represented both tremendous opportunity and considerable risk. A successful meeting could establish her as Antony's primary ally in the East, providing Egypt with influence over Roman policy that no client kingdom had ever possessed. But the personal nature of the proposed alliance could also create enemies among Romans, who viewed close relationships between their leaders and Eastern rulers as evidence of corruption or disloyalty to traditional Roman values. Her decision to accept the invitation demonstrated the confidence she had gained through her previous diplomatic successes. She understood that Egypt's security ultimately depended on maintaining favorable relationships with whoever controlled Roman policy, and the current circumstances suggested that Antony was likely to be the dominant figure in Eastern affairs for the foreseeable future. But Cleopatra was determined to ensure that the meeting would take place on terms that emphasized her status as an independent ruler rather than a subordinate seeking favor. She spent weeks planning an approach to Tarsus that would demonstrate Egyptian power and sophistication while creating the psychological conditions for successful negotiations. The spectacle she created for her arrival at Tarsus would become one of the most famous episodes in ancient history, though later accounts would often focus on romantic elements while overlooking the sophisticated political calculations that shaped every aspect of her presentation. Cleopatra understood that first impressions were crucial in diplomatic encounters, and she was determined to establish herself as a worthy partner, rather than merely another Eastern ruler seeking Roman protection. Her preparation began with the selection of a vessel that would serve as both transportation and stage for her dramatic entrance. Egyptian shipwrights constructed what was essentially a floating palace, decorated with gold and purple fabrics that proclaimed royal status while incorporating design elements that would appeal to Roman aesthetic sensibilities. The crew selected for this voyage represented the elite of Egyptian maritime expertise, chosen not only for their technical skills, but also for their ability to perform the complex ceremonial functions that would be required during the formal presentations in Tarsus. Every aspect of their appearance and behavior was carefully choreographed to reinforce the image of Egyptian competence and prosperity. Cleopatra's personal preparations for the meeting were equally meticulous. She selected clothing and jewelry that would demonstrate Egyptian wealth while conforming to standards of dignity, appropriate for a diplomatic encounter between heads of state. Her appearance needed to convey confidence and authority without appearing to compete inappropriately with Roman symbols of power. More importantly, she spent considerable time preparing for the substantive discussions that would determine the practical outcomes of their meeting. She developed detailed proposals for military cooperation, economic partnerships, and administrative coordination that would benefit both Egyptian and Roman interests, while preserving the autonomy that was essential for her kingdom's long-term survival. These preparations reflected Cleopatra's understanding that successful diplomacy required far more than personal charm or cultural display. She needed to offer concrete benefits that would make partnership with Egypt attractive to Antony, while establishing frameworks for cooperation that could survive changes in political circumstances or personal relationships. The voyage to Tarsus provided final opportunities for reviewing her strategy and anticipating the challenges she would face during the negotiations. The intelligence reports she had received about Antony's current situation suggested that he was under considerable pressure to demonstrate his ability to govern the eastern provinces effectively, while also preparing for potential future conflicts with Octavian. These pressures created both opportunities and constraints for Egyptian diplomacy. Antony's need for reliable allies made him likely to offer favorable terms to kingdoms that could provide meaningful support. But his awareness that other Romans were monitoring his relationships with Eastern rulers meant that any agreements would need to be structured in ways that could withstand criticism from his domestic political opponents. Cleopatra's approach to managing these competing considerations demonstrated the political maturity she had developed during her years of navigating complex international relationships. She would offer substantial benefits to Antony's administration while maintaining enough independence to avoid appearing as merely a Roman puppet. She would demonstrate personal respect for Antony while preserving the dignity appropriate to her status as Pharaoh of Egypt. The arrival at Tarsus unfolded exactly as Cleopatra had planned, creating a spectacle that impressed Roman observers while establishing the psychological framework for successful negotiations. Contemporary accounts describe crowds of local residents gathering along the waterfront to witness the approach of the Egyptian fleet, their excitement building as the magnificent royal barge became visible in the distance. The visual impact was overwhelming. Golden decorations caught the sunlight as hundreds of oars moved in perfect synchronization, while the sounds of Egyptian music and the fragrances of exotic incense created a sensory experience unlike anything most Romans had ever encountered. The overall effect was to present Egyptian civilization as both wealthy and sophisticated, capable of contributing meaningfully to any alliance while maintaining its distinctive cultural identity. Antony's response to Cleopatra's arrival revealed both his political intelligence and his genuine appreciation for the diplomatic skills she was demonstrating. He recognized immediately that she was establishing herself as an equal partner rather than a subordinate seeking favors, and he adapted his own approach accordingly. The formal presentations that followed their initial meeting provided both rulers with opportunities to assess each other's capabilities and intentions. Cleopatra demonstrated her knowledge of Roman politics and her understanding of the challenges Antony faced in governing the eastern provinces, Antony showed his familiarity with Egyptian affairs and his respect for the kingdom's historical achievements and current capabilities. But the real substance of their relationship emerged during the private discussions that took place over several days as they worked through the details of potential cooperation. These conversations revealed the remarkable compatibility between two experienced rulers who understood the complexities of governing in a world where political survival required constant adaptation to changing circumstances. Both Cleopatra and Antony had risen to power through combinations of intelligence, courage, and political skill, rather than simply inheriting positions through family connections. Both understood how to balance competing demands from different constituencies while maintaining the flexibility necessary for effective leadership in uncertain times. Most importantly, both recognized that their individual success depended on their ability to forge relationships that served mutual interests while preserving their respective independence. The alliance that emerged from their meetings at Tarsus would reshape the balance of power in the Mediterranean world, while creating new possibilities for cooperation between Roman and Egyptian civilizations. But it would also generate opposition from forces within Rome that viewed such partnerships as threats to traditional Roman supremacy and cultural purity. The personal relationship that developed alongside their political alliance added another dimension of complexity to an already intricate diplomatic situation. The attraction between them was genuine and mutual, but it was also inextricably connected to the strategic calculations that had brought them together in the first place. For Cleopatra, the relationship with Antony represented the culmination of a lifetime spent preparing for exactly this kind of opportunity to secure Egyptian independence through partnership with Rome's most powerful leaders. For Antony, the alliance with Egypt provided resources and expertise that could enable him to succeed where other Roman commanders had struggled to create stable governance in the diverse territories of the eastern Mediterranean. As their ships prepared to depart Tarsus with agreements that would bind their fates together for years to come, both rulers understood that they were embarking on a path that would either establish them as the dominant power in their respective spheres or lead to their mutual destruction at the hands of enemies who would never accept the legitimacy of their partnership. The meeting that had begun as a diplomatic negotiation between allied rulers had evolved into something far more significant: the founding of a new form of Mediterranean governance that combined Roman military power with Egyptian wealth and Eastern administrative expertise. Whether this experiment would succeed or fail would depend on their ability to overcome the cultural prejudices, political opposition, and military challenges that were already beginning to coalesce against their revolutionary alliance. The woman who had transformed herself from exiled princess to Mediterranean queen was about to discover whether her most audacious political gamble would secure the independence she had fought so hard to achieve or lead to the final confrontation that would determine the fate of the ancient world. The months following the historic meeting at Tarsus witnessed a transformation in Mediterranean politics that reverberated from the marble halls of Rome to the bustling marketplaces of Alexandria. Cleopatra returned to Egypt not merely as a pharaoh who had secured favorable terms with a Roman commander, but as a partner in an alliance that challenged fundamental assumptions about how the ancient world should be governed. The agreements she had forged with Mark Antony were revolutionary in their scope and implications. Unlike the traditional client relationships that characterized Rome's dealings with Eastern kingdoms, this partnership treated Egypt as an equal contributor to joint enterprises that would benefit both civilizations. Egyptian administrative expertise would be combined with Roman military organization to create more effective governance throughout the eastern provinces. But implementing these ambitious plans required Cleopatra to overcome significant resistance within her own kingdom, from advisors who questioned whether such close cooperation with Rome would ultimately compromise Egyptian independence. Conservative nobles argued that previous pharaohs had maintained Egypt's distinctive identity through careful distance from foreign powers, while younger officials worried that their careers might suffer if Roman administrators gained too much influence over domestic affairs. Cleopatra addressed these concerns through a series of carefully planned presentations that demonstrated how the new alliance would strengthen rather than weaken Egyptian sovereignty. She explained that partnership with Antony would provide Egypt with protection against potential threats from Parthia and other Eastern powers, while creating new opportunities for Egyptian merchants and scholars to expand their influence throughout the Mediterranean world. More persuasively, she pointed to the concrete benefits that were already flowing from the alliance. Roman engineering expertise was being applied to improve Alexandria's harbour facilities, while Egyptian agricultural techniques were being introduced in Roman territories where they could increase crop yields. The exchange of knowledge and resources was creating prosperity for both partners, while maintaining the distinct cultural identities that made each civilization valuable. The success of these early collaborative projects helped convince skeptical Egyptians that the alliance served their kingdom's interests rather than merely advancing Cleopatra's personal ambitions. Provincial governors reported increased trade revenues as new markets opened for Egyptian goods. Temple priests found Roman scholars eager to learn about Egyptian religious and philosophical traditions. Military commanders appreciated access to Roman tactical innovations that could improve Egypt's defensive capabilities. But Cleopatra understood that the ultimate test of her alliance with Antony would come when they faced opposition from forces within Rome that viewed their partnership as a threat to traditional Roman supremacy. Intelligence reports from across the Mediterranean suggested that Octavian and his supporters were already developing arguments against what they characterized as Eastern corruption of Roman values and institutions. These criticisms focused particularly on the personal dimension of the relationship between Cleopatra and Antony, which Roman traditionalists portrayed as evidence that foreign influences were undermining the moral discipline that had made Rome great. The fact that their partnership had produced children created additional complications, as opponents could argue that Antony was placing personal interests above Roman strategic objectives. Cleopatra recognized that defending the alliance would require more than diplomatic arguments or demonstrations of practical benefits. She needed to build broader support within Roman society for the idea that cooperation with Eastern civilizations could strengthen rather than weaken Roman power. This meant engaging with Roman intellectuals, merchants, and military officers who might appreciate the advantages of partnership even if they were initially suspicious of foreign influence. Her approach to this challenge revealed the sophisticated understanding of Roman culture she had developed through years of careful observation and analysis. She began hosting gatherings in Alexandria that brought together Roman visitors with Egyptian scholars, creating opportunities for intellectual exchange that demonstrated the compatibility between different traditions of learning and governance. These cultural initiatives were designed to counter the narrative that Eastern and Roman civilizations were fundamentally incompatible. By showcasing Egyptian achievements in mathematics, astronomy, and medicine alongside Roman accomplishments in law, engineering, and military organization, Cleopatra could argue that cooperation between the two cultures would produce innovations that neither could achieve independently. The Library of Alexandria became a symbol of this collaborative approach, as Roman scholars worked alongside Egyptian researchers on projects that advanced human knowledge, while strengthening bonds between their respective civilizations. Joint expeditions explored the sources of the Nile and the trade routes that connected the Mediterranean with the Indian Ocean, producing geographical knowledge that benefited both Roman strategic planning and Egyptian commercial enterprises. Meanwhile, Antony was implementing his own strategies for building support within Rome for continued cooperation with Eastern allies. He emphasized the military advantages that Egyptian resources provided for defending Roman interests against Parthian expansion and other threats that could not be addressed effectively without Eastern support. His reports to the Roman Senate highlighted successful joint operations that had strengthened Roman control over disputed territories while reducing the costs of maintaining large garrison forces in distant provinces. Egyptian naval capabilities had proven essential for protecting Mediterranean shipping routes. while Egyptian financial resources had enabled infrastructure projects that benefited Roman citizens and allies throughout the Eastern territories. But Antony's position was complicated by the growing tensions with Octavian that were making cooperation between the triumvirs increasingly difficult to maintain. Personal rivalries and policy disagreements were creating pressures that threatened to destroy the political settlement that had emerged from their victory over Brutus and Cassius. The situation was further complicated by developments in Italy, where Octavian was consolidating his authority through methods that some observers characterized as increasingly autocratic. His control over Caesar's veterans and his manipulation of traditional Roman institutions were creating a form of personal rule that differed significantly from the collaborative approach that Antony was pursuing in the eastern provinces. These differences in governing style reflected deeper philosophical disagreements about how the Roman world should be organized and administered. Octavian represented continuity with traditional Roman approaches that emphasized centralized control and cultural uniformity. Antony advocated for more flexible arrangements that could accommodate the diversity of peoples and customs that characterized the expanded Roman territories. For Cleopatra, these tensions within the triumvirate created both opportunities and dangers. If Antony succeeded in maintaining his authority over the eastern provinces while building broader support for his approach to governance, Egypt could benefit from continued partnership with a leader who appreciated the value of Eastern contributions to Roman success. But if Octavian managed to eliminate Antony as a rival and impose his vision of Roman supremacy throughout the Mediterranean, Egypt might face demands for greater subordination that could threaten the independence Cleopatra had worked so hard to preserve. The challenge was determining how to prepare for either outcome while avoiding actions that might accelerate the confrontation between the two Roman leaders. Cleopatra needed to maintain her alliance with Antony while preserving enough flexibility to adapt to changed circumstances if his position weakened or if opportunities emerged for accommodation with Octavian. Her strategy during this delicate period involved strengthening Egypt's internal capabilities while building relationships that could survive changes in Roman leadership. She continued investing in military improvements that would make Egypt a more valuable ally, regardless of which Roman faction ultimately controlled imperial policy. Simultaneously, she worked to expand Egyptian influence throughout the Eastern Mediterranean through diplomatic and commercial initiatives that did not depend entirely on Roman support. New trading partnerships with kingdoms beyond Rome's direct control created alternative sources of revenue and political influence that could provide options if circumstances required greater independence from Roman protection. The birth of additional children during this period added both personal joy and political complexity to Cleopatra's situation. The growing family she shared with Antony created stronger bonds between them, while also providing opponents with additional ammunition for arguments about divided loyalties and foreign corruption of Roman leadership. But these children also represented the future of the alliance between Egyptian and Roman civilizations. If properly educated and positioned, they could serve as bridges between different cultures, while potentially inheriting positions that would continue their parents' work of creating more cooperative relationships between East and West. Cleopatra's approach to raising these children reflected her understanding of the complex world they would inherit. They received educations that combined Egyptian traditions with Roman customs, learning to speak multiple languages while studying both Eastern and Western approaches to governance, military strategy, and cultural achievement. The palace schools where they studied alongside children from prominent Egyptian families became laboratories for developing new forms of Mediterranean civilization that could incorporate the best elements from different traditions. These educational experiments provided models for the kind of cultural synthesis that Cleopatra believed would characterize the future of the ancient world. As the children grew, they became living symbols of the possibility for cooperation between civilizations that had previously been viewed as fundamentally incompatible. Their existence challenged traditional assumptions about cultural purity, while demonstrating that hybrid identities could be sources of strength rather than weakness. But the domestic harmony that characterized Cleopatra's family life was increasingly threatened by the political storms that were gathering throughout the Roman world. Reports from Italy suggested that Octavian was preparing for a final confrontation with Antony that would determine the future structure of Roman government and the role that Eastern allies would play in imperial administration. The propaganda war that preceded this military confrontation revealed the depth of cultural and political divisions that had developed within Roman society. Octavian's supporters portrayed the conflict as a struggle between traditional Roman values and foreign corruption, while Antony's allies argued that Rome's future depended on embracing the diversity and resources that Eastern partnerships could provide. Cleopatra found herself at the center of these debates. Portrayed by Octavian's faction as the foreign temptress who had corrupted Roman leadership, while being celebrated by Antony's supporters as the wise queen whose alliance had strengthened Roman power in the Eastern Mediterranean, the accuracy of these competing narratives mattered less than their political effectiveness in shaping public opinion throughout the Roman world. The escalating rhetoric created an environment where compromise between the rival factions became increasingly unlikely. Both sides were committed to visions of Roman greatness that seemed incompatible with continued cooperation, making military confrontation the probable resolution to tensions that had been building for years. For Cleopatra, the approaching crisis represented the ultimate test of the political skills she had developed during her remarkable rise to power. She would need to navigate the final phase of the Roman civil wars while protecting Egyptian interests and preserving the independence she had fought so hard to achieve. The decisions she made during the coming months would determine not only her personal fate and that of her children, but also the survival of the Egyptian civilization that had flourished along the Nile for over 3 millennia. The woman who had once smuggled herself into Alexandria to forge an alliance with Julius Caesar was about to face the greatest challenge of her extraordinary career. The stakes could not have been higher, and the outcome would reshape the ancient world in ways that would influence human civilization for centuries to come. Everything Cleopatra had learned about power, diplomacy, and survival would be tested in a final confrontation that would either establish her as one of history's most successful rulers or mark the end of an era that had begun with Alexander's conquest of Egypt 3 centuries earlier. As storm clouds gathered over the Mediterranean world, the last pharaoh of Egypt prepared for the battle that would determine whether her remarkable legacy would inspire future generations or serve as a cautionary tale about the limits of individual ambition in a world dominated by forces beyond any single person's control. The summer of 33 BCE brought ominous signs that the uneasy peace between Octavian and Antony was finally approaching its inevitable end. Diplomatic communications between the two triumvirs had virtually ceased, replaced by public declarations that made their mutual hostility increasingly obvious to observers throughout the Roman world. From her palace in Alexandria, Cleopatra monitored these developments with the careful attention of someone whose survival depended on accurately predicting the outcome of the approaching conflict. Her intelligence networks provided detailed reports about military preparations in both Italy and the eastern provinces, revealing the enormous scale of the forces that both sides were assembling for what promised to be the decisive battle of the Roman civil wars. Octavian's advantages were substantial and clearly visible to anyone familiar with Roman politics. He controlled Italy and its resources, including the loyalty of Caesar's veterans who had been settled on Italian lands. His propaganda portrayed him as the defender of traditional Roman values against foreign corruption, a message that resonated with citizens who were tired of civil wars and eager for stability. But Antony's position also possessed significant strengths that made the outcome of any confrontation far from predetermined. He commanded the wealthiest provinces of the Roman world, including Egypt, Syria, and Asia Minor, providing him with financial resources that exceeded anything available to his rival. His military experience was extensive, and his reputation among professional soldiers remained formidable despite the criticisms directed at his personal life. Most importantly for Egyptian interests, Antony's approach to governing the Eastern territories had demonstrated genuine appreciation for non-Roman contributions to imperial success. His willingness to work with local rulers and incorporate Eastern administrative practices had created more stable and prosperous conditions than had existed under previous Roman arrangements. Cleopatra's analysis of the strategic situation convinced her that supporting Antony remained Egypt's best option for preserving the independence and prosperity she had worked so hard to achieve. The alternative of accommodation with Octavian seemed likely to result in greater subordination to Roman control and the loss of the special relationship that had made Egypt such an influential player in Mediterranean politics. But she also understood that her kingdom's survival could not depend entirely on Antony's success in the coming conflict. Egypt needed to be prepared for any outcome, including scenarios where neither triumvir emerged completely victorious, or where the Roman world fragmented into competing spheres of influence that might create new opportunities for independent action. Her preparations during this crucial period revealed the comprehensive understanding of statecraft she had developed during her years as pharaoh. Military forces were strengthened and positioned to defend Egyptian territory, while also being available to support Antony's operations if circumstances required joint action. Economic resources were accumulated and protected to ensure that Egypt could survive disruptions to normal trade relationships. Diplomatic initiatives were launched to maintain relationships with neutral parties who might play important roles in post-conflict settlements, regardless of which Roman faction ultimately prevailed. These efforts included communications with Persian and Arabian rulers who had remained outside Roman control, as well as with Greek cities and minor kingdoms that might regain some independence if Roman authority weakened. The complexity of these preparations required Cleopatra to manage multiple competing priorities simultaneously, while maintaining the appearance of confident leadership that was essential for domestic stability. She needed to prepare for war without provoking premature conflict, accumulate resources without damaging Egypt's economy, and build alternative relationships without appearing disloyal to existing alliances. The psychological pressure of this period was enormous, but Cleopatra drew strength from her previous experiences of surviving political crises through careful planning and decisive action. She had overcome seemingly impossible challenges before by maintaining clarity about her objectives while adapting her methods to changing circumstances. The final break between Octavian and Antony came in the autumn of 33 BCE, when their remaining legal arrangements expired and neither side made serious efforts to renew them. The triumvirate that had governed the Roman world for over a decade was officially dissolved, leaving both men free to pursue their rivalry through military means. Octavian's declaration of war was carefully crafted to maximize political advantage while minimizing legal complications. Rather than declaring war against Antony directly, which might have raised questions about Roman citizens fighting each other, he declared war against Cleopatra as a foreign enemy who threatened Roman security and independence. So, this strategic decision revealed Octavian's sophisticated understanding of Roman political psychology. By portraying the conflict as a war against foreign enemies rather than a civil war between Roman factions, he could appeal to patriotic sentiments while avoiding the negative associations that Romans had developed toward internal conflicts that had caused so much suffering and instability. For Cleopatra, Octavian's declaration represented both a challenge and an opportunity. Being named as Rome's primary enemy was dangerous, but it also acknowledged her importance and influence in ways that elevated her status throughout the Mediterranean world. She was no longer merely a client ruler seeking Roman protection, but a sovereign leader whose power was substantial enough to threaten the world's dominant empire. Her response to the declaration revealed the confidence and political maturity she had gained through decades of navigating complex international relationships. Rather than defensive protestations of innocence or appeals for negotiated settlement, she embraced her role as leader of the Eastern coalition that would resist Octavian's attempt to impose his vision of Roman supremacy throughout the Mediterranean. The manifesto she issued from Alexandria presented the coming conflict as a struggle between two different approaches to organizing the ancient world. Octavian represented narrow Roman nationalism that would suppress the diversity and creativity of Eastern civilizations. The alliance between Egypt and Antony offered a more inclusive vision that could incorporate the best elements from different cultures while preserving the distinctive traditions that made each region valuable. This framing of the conflict had significant strategic advantages beyond its propaganda value. By presenting herself as the champion of Eastern independence, rather than merely Antony's ally, Cleopatra could potentially attract support from rulers and peoples who might otherwise remain neutral in what appeared to be a Roman civil war. The months that followed saw intensive diplomatic activity as both sides sought to build coalitions that would provide advantages in the military confrontation that was clearly approaching. Cleopatra's efforts focused particularly on kingdoms and cities that had maintained some independence from Roman control, or that had reasons to resist further Roman expansion. Her success in these diplomatic initiatives exceeded even her own expectations. Rulers from Armenia to Arabia expressed willingness to contribute resources or military support to resist Octavian's expansion of Roman control over their territories. Greek cities that had chafed under Roman taxation saw opportunities to regain some of their traditional autonomy. But the most significant diplomatic achievement was securing the active support of several Roman senators and military commanders who had concluded that Octavian's increasingly autocratic behavior threatened the republican institutions they had sworn to defend. These defections provided the Eastern coalition with legitimacy within Roman political culture, while also contributing military expertise and knowledge of Octavian's strategic planning. The coalition that emerged from these diplomatic efforts was more diverse and extensive than anything the Mediterranean world had seen since the campaigns of Alexander the Great. It included traditional monarchies and democratic city-states, wealthy trading centers and agricultural regions, veteran Roman legions and exotic Eastern cavalry units. Managing this diverse alliance required all of Cleopatra's diplomatic skills and cultural understanding. She needed to coordinate military operations between forces that used different languages, tactical systems, and command structures, while maintaining unity of purpose among leaders whose ultimate objectives might diverge significantly. The logistical challenges were equally daunting. Supplying and coordinating armies scattered across thousands of miles of territory required administrative capabilities that exceeded anything previously attempted in ancient warfare. Egyptian organizational expertise became crucial for managing the complex supply chains and communication networks that held the coalition together. As winter turned to spring in 32 BCE, both sides completed their preparations for the campaign that would determine the future of the ancient world. The forces assembled for this conflict dwarfed anything seen in previous Roman civil wars, reflecting the enormous resources that both coalitions had mobilized for their final confrontation. Cleopatra's personal involvement in these preparations demonstrated her evolution from diplomatic negotiator to active military leader. She participated in strategic planning sessions, supervised the construction of warships specifically designed for the naval battles that were expected to play crucial roles, and worked directly with commanders to ensure that Egyptian forces could operate effectively alongside their diverse allies. The woman who had once risked everything to forge an alliance with Julius Caesar was now commanding resources and wielding influence that made her one of the most powerful individuals in the ancient world. But she also understood that all her achievements would be meaningless if the coming battle resulted in defeat and the destruction of everything she had worked to build. The stakes of the approaching confrontation extended far beyond personal survival or even Egyptian independence. The outcome would determine whether the Mediterranean world would be unified under a single Roman authority or remain a diverse collection of civilizations that could interact as equals while maintaining their distinctive identities. For Cleopatra, The battle represented the culmination of a lifetime spent preparing for exactly this moment, when individual skill and determination could influence the course of human history. Everything she had learned about politics, warfare, and leadership would be tested in a confrontation that would either vindicate her vision of cooperative Mediterranean civilization or mark the end of an era that had begun with the conquests of Alexander. As her fleet prepared to sail from Alexandria's harbour for the final time, Cleopatra stood once more on the palace balcony where she had contemplated so many crucial decisions during her remarkable reign. The gentle evening breeze carried the sounds of a city preparing for war, but also the timeless rhythms of a civilization that had endured along the Nile for over 3,000 years. The last pharaoh of Egypt was about to discover whether her extraordinary journey from powerless exile to Mediterranean queen would end in triumph or tragedy. But she faced that uncertainty with the same courage and intelligence that had carried her through every previous challenge of her incredible career. The armada that departed Alexandria in the early hours of September 31st BCE represented more than just a military force sailing toward destiny. These 500 vessels carried with them the accumulated wisdom of 3 millennia of Egyptian civilization, the dreams of Eastern peoples who yearned for independence from Roman dominance, and the personal ambitions of a woman who had transformed herself into the most powerful queen in the ancient world. Cleopatra's flagship, magnificent beyond anything the Mediterranean had ever witnessed, cut through the gentle swells as its golden prow pointed toward the coast of Greece, where Octavian's forces were gathering for the confrontation that would reshape the ancient world. The ship itself had become a floating symbol of the cultural synthesis she had spent her reign promoting, combining Egyptian craftsmanship with Roman engineering innovations and Greek artistic traditions. The crew that manned this extraordinary vessel represented the diversity of the coalition she had assembled. Egyptian sailors worked alongside Syrian navigators, while Greek marines shared deck space with Roman defectors who had abandoned Octavian's cause. Their ability to function as a unified fighting force, despite their different backgrounds and languages, demonstrated the practical viability of the inclusive approach to governance that Cleopatra and Antony were championing. But beneath the surface unity lay tensions and uncertainties that reflected the enormous challenges facing any attempt to unite such diverse peoples under a single command structure. Language barriers created communication difficulties that could prove fatal during the confusion of naval combat. Cultural differences in military traditions and tactical preferences required constant negotiation and compromise to maintain operational effectiveness. Most significantly, the personal loyalties of individual commanders remained divided between their immediate obligations to the coalition and their longer-term concerns about survival in a world where backing the losing side could mean death or exile for themselves and their families. The pragmatic calculations that had brought these forces together could just as easily tear them apart if circumstances changed, or if alternative opportunities for advancement appeared. Cleopatra understood these vulnerabilities better than anyone, having spent months observing the complex dynamics within her own alliance, while also monitoring intelligence reports about similar problems affecting Octavian's forces. The key to victory would not be eliminating these tensions entirely, which was impossible, but managing them effectively enough to maintain coalition unity during the crucial phases of the upcoming battle. Her approach to this challenge revealed the sophisticated leadership skills she had developed during her years of governing Egypt and managing relationships with Roman leaders. Rather than pretending that problems did not exist or attempting to impose artificial harmony through authoritarian control, she acknowledged difficulties openly while working to address their underlying causes. Regular councils brought together commanders from different contingents to discuss tactical coordination and resolve disputes before they could undermine operational effectiveness. Cultural liaisons helped translate not just languages, but also the different military traditions and expectations that shaped how various units preferred to fight and be commanded. Most importantly, Cleopatra ensured that all coalition members understood the broader strategic objectives that made their cooperation essential. The battle they were approaching was not merely another Roman civil war where the winner would simply replace the loser in controlling the same imperial system. It was a fundamental struggle over whether the Mediterranean world would be governed through centralized Roman authority or through more flexible arrangements that preserve space for diverse civilizations to flourish. The voyage toward their rendezvous with Antony's forces provided final opportunities for Cleopatra to refine her strategy and prepare for the challenges that lay ahead. Intelligence reports suggested that Octavian had assembled a formidable fleet of his own, commanded by experienced Roman admirals who understood the tactical innovations that had made Roman naval power so effective during previous Mediterranean conflicts. But these same reports also revealed weaknesses in Octavian's position that could be exploited by skilled opponents who understood how to coordinate complex operations involving multiple types of vessels and diverse tactical approaches. His fleet was primarily composed of traditional Roman warships, designed for the ramming and boarding tactics that had proven successful in earlier conflicts against Mediterranean pirates and rival Roman factions. The coalition forces under Cleopatra and Antony's command included vessel types and fighting techniques that Roman commanders had limited experience confronting Egyptian ships, incorporated design innovations that emphasized speed and maneuverability over the raw strength that characterized Roman construction. Eastern archers and siege engineers brought weapons and tactics that could neutralize some of the advantages that Roman forces typically enjoyed in close combat. More subtly, the diverse composition of the coalition fleet created opportunities for tactical deceptions and strategic surprises that would be difficult to achieve with more homogeneous forces. Units that appeared to be retreating or withdrawing could actually be repositioning themselves for flanking attacks that enemy commanders might not anticipate from forces they assumed were operating according to familiar Roman or Greek tactical doctrines. Cleopatra's personal role in coordinating these complex tactical possibilities demonstrated how thoroughly she had mastered the military dimensions of leadership that had once seemed beyond the reach of any woman in the ancient world. She could discuss the technical specifications of different vessel types, evaluate the effectiveness of various weapons systems under different weather conditions, and analyze how the timing of specific maneuvers could influence the outcome of large-scale naval engagements. Her commanders, initially skeptical about taking tactical direction from someone they viewed primarily as a diplomatic leader, gradually developed genuine respect for her strategic insights and operational planning capabilities. She understood not just the theoretical principles of naval warfare, but also the practical realities of maintaining discipline and coordination among diverse forces during the confusion and violence of actual combat. And so ends the remarkable journey of Cleopatra VII, the last pharaoh of Egypt, whose intelligence, courage, and political genius transformed her from an exiled teenager into one of history's most powerful rulers. Through palace intrigue, civil wars, and the collapse of the Roman Republic itself, she wielded diplomacy as skillfully as any general commanded armies, speaking 9 languages and commanding the loyalty of both her people and the most influential leaders of her time. Her story reminds us that true power lies not in birth or beauty, but in the relentless pursuit of knowledge, the courage to take extraordinary risks, and the wisdom to adapt when the world itself is changing around you. Sweet dreams.